Welcome everyone to today's webinar, The Impact of COVID-19 on the New York City Economy and the Policy Response. The webinar today is sponsored by Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, the Urban and Social Policy Concentration. I'm Esther Fuchs, I'm the director of that concentration, and the Management Specialization. We're really delighted that you could be with us this afternoon, and I promise you this is going to be a very exciting and informative conversation. We now all understand that COVID-19 is not just a public health crisis, as if that wasn't enough. But COVID-19 has also triggered an economic crisis in our nation and fiscal crises in states and city governments all across the country. And of course, New York is never a laggard, so we're leading on all these crises. New York is actually facing more financial pressure on its budget than it has since the 1970s, and this is quite extraordinary. Today, we have an exceptional panel and moderator, so that we expect you all to engage with interesting questions for our panelists. It's not just their job to inform you, it's your job to ask them interesting questions. We'll focus on understanding the impact of COVID-19 on the city's finances overall, and how to actually rebuild and reimagine New York, specifically focusing on two areas that are critical to recovery: public education and jobs, workforce development, getting New Yorkers back to work. So it's my personal pleasure to introduce our moderator this afternoon, Sarah Holloway. All of you know Sarah as the director of the Management Specialization at SIPA. I should add, it is our largest specialization. I think Sarah has over 200 students in the Management Specialization. She teaches 3 courses: nonprofit finance, social enterprise, and design for social innovation. And by the way, Sarah will introduce the panelists, who are also all members of our SIPA faculty, among the other things that they do. This is really an important topic, and I'm really thrilled that Sarah agreed to be the moderator for this panel discussion. Believe it or not, I'm going to step out of the window and let Sarah take over. Enjoy, everyone.
Thank you so much, Esther. And basically, if Esther asks, I always say yes. So thank you for having me today. So quick overview of the format. So I will have a dialogue with our 3 SIPA faculty panelists until about 2:55. In the meantime, we would love for you to post questions to the Q&A section. We will collect those and then at 2:55 turn to your questions. So please remember to put them in the Q&A section, and let's get underway. So as Esther mentioned, the 3 panelists are all faculty members at the School of International and Public Affairs. I will quickly introduce each of them. So Francesco Brindisi, who is a Deputy Director of the New York City Office of Management and Budget, and he oversees economic and tax forecasting and state and local tax policy. Clearly, he's been very busy of late. He received his Ph.D. in economics from Columbia, and he teaches courses on urban economics, public finance, and the economics of New York City. John Liu is currently state senator for the 11th district in the northeast of Queens. He is the former controller of New York City and a former New York City council member, and he's also currently serving as the chairman of the New York City Education Committee. And he teaches budgeting and financial management for government at SIPA. Thank you, John. And then Stanley Litow. Stan spent 25 years at IBM overseeing their corporate social responsibility and the IBM Foundation. Prior to that, he was the former Deputy Schools Chancellor of the New York City Public Schools, and is currently a member of the Mayor's Education Advisory Council on New York City school reopening. and he teaches about government, civil society, and how corporations can solve societal problems, both at SIPA and at Duke. So I want to kick this off talking a little bit about the budget and the budget process. So the city budget recently was passed. It's an $88.2 billion budget for the fiscal year 2021, which is a 5% cut from last year, I understand. Francesco, would love to hear about sort of your background on how that budget was developed and how you came up with those forecasts to actually create this budget, and whether you think that forecast will hold up.
Right, there's a secret sauce to the forecast, you know, as you can imagine. Well, thank you everybody. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with the other panelists as well. I guess it speaks to the special times we're in that you know, the city needs to have a financial plan pretty much every quarter. In January, propose a preliminary plan, which needs to be balanced for the current and the next fiscal year. January seemed like a year where, you know, we were in the 11th year of the economic recovery and everything was chugging along and the economy was doing well. And then all of a sudden comes March and, you know, there are these non-pharmaceutical interventions, policy interventions to stop the spread of the disease that pretty much, you know, shut down the economy, right? So we took the elevator down. The implication of that is that, you know, because we need to, the city needs to have another update, the executive budget in April, which it also has to be balanced for the current and the next fiscal year. We sort of found ourselves very close to the end of the fiscal year with, you know, trying to understand what the implications would be of the pandemic. You know, there are some top line numbers, I guess, that as far as they concern the job that I do at OMB, which is the revision of tax revenues from the January plan to the executive plan. And then from the executive plan to the adoption, the budget that was actually adopted, you know, all in all, we needed to cut, we cut the tax revenue forecast by 9 billion in fiscal year 20, which is the one that just finished, and in fiscal year 21, which is the one that just started on July 1st. And also, you know, we lowered our forecast for the out years. The financial plan has got 5 years, so we have forecast that goes up to fiscal year 24. So that's, you know, those 9 billion that also the mayor talks about. You know, we have a balanced budget requirement. Therefore, you know, the budget needs to go down, the expenses need to go down by, you know, a proportionate amount by cutting somewhere else. You know, to say that we live in very uncertain times, it's, you know, comically inadequate. You know, we typically have our problems forecasting the economy, and this times it's, you know, compounded several times because, you know, there is also a lot of uncertainty about how the disease is going to progress. So without, you know, making it too long and too boring, you know, we have a US forecast, economic forecast, and then we have a New York City model with a number of equations to model, you know, economic relationships in the city. We ran that, you know, in March, pretty much towards the end of March, beginning on April, so that we could present the executive budget, and that's, you know, the main forecast upon which the tax forecast is predicated upon. And then we adjusted the tax forecast based on actual data that we get on collections of tax revenues for the adopted budget. You know, I think that the main, you know, whether it's going to hold up, of course, we're going to be wrong. You know, every forecast is always wrong, right? That depends on what order of magnitude. I think, you know, if I had to think about, you know, what's the main risk, you know, whether it's an upside or downside, you know, I would say that there is a downside risk, and it's mostly tied to a resurgence of the disease, and, you know, and whether the economy will have to shut down again, or we're going to, you know, if not shut down again completely, we, you know, roll back some of these phases of the reopening. There are many other aspects, people working from home, whether, who's going to use the real estate, how the real estate is going to be used, where are they going to file their taxes, and so on and so forth, which maybe we'll go into some more detail later on, but, this is my opening salvo, I guess.
Yeah, and quick question for you, and actually John, who I want to turn to next, which is, obviously you did this whole process for the first time on Zoom or on telephones. How was that different?
It worked like a charm, and that's what worries me, going forward, because this is something that is going to stay. Not everybody, working from home is not for everybody at all times, but there is going to be some sort of structural adjustment, and we don't know what that implies for, where people are going to live and where people are going to work, and what's the value of the real estate in the city, right? So those are things that will become clearer as time goes on.
Yes. So John, I know you're a state senator, but you obviously know the city budget incredibly well. What's your sense of the new budget and where New Yorkers will feel the cuts the most? And also curious about sort of individual city agencies and how they will be impacted.
Well, I don't know if I can add that much more to what Commissioner Brindisi has already talked about. The city of New York is actually not in such a different boat as other major cities across the country, and the state of New York, as well as other states across the country as well. At the beginning, New York City and the state of New York certainly were the epicenter of this COVID-19 crisis. But now we're actually no longer the epicenter. The epicenter has spread to all different parts of the nation. And so many state and local governments are facing the same kinds of pressure that we are facing here at home. The city has a $9 billion projected revenue shortfall for the coming fiscal year that actually just started a couple of weeks ago. The state had already projected between 9 and 15 billion, closer to $15 billion shortfall in revenues for the new fiscal year. And those revenue shortfalls are not difficult to understand. Lots of people are out of work. We are at a very high unemployment rate now in the New York area, as well as in other parts of the country. People don't have jobs, they don't have income. Many people aren't able to pay their rent. That's going to trickle down into people not paying mortgages, not being able to pay mortgages or even their property taxes. And when people aren't working, income tax revenues are far off. And when people aren't spending, especially when restaurants are closed or have been closed for such a long time, other services like entertainment venues and barbershops, they've been shut down for so long until recently reopening again. Those are all devastating our tax revenues. So there's no question that we are far short. It's not even because of the unexpected spending that COVID-19 has required state and local governments to cough up. It's really this sheer shortfall in the revenues that we're all trying to get through. The solution here has to come from Washington. And, Washington has already enacted a few rounds of stimulus packages, mostly aimed towards the private sector. Certainly small businesses needed help, especially with the PPP program. The large corporate entities also benefited from PPP. And the other industries, particularly the airline industry, got direct bailouts.
Yeah.
What we're trying to get the Republican senators in Washington to understand is that as much as we don't want the economy to fall through the floor by propping up some of the critical critical private sector components, the public sector is a big component of the economy as well. And the large bulk of the public sector in the U.S. economy is funded through state and local governments. And what are we talking about? We're talking about teachers, talking about police officers, firefighters, healthcare workers. This is the bulk of the public sector that we've been relying on, and we're not going to be able to have anymore if Washington does not pass a round of stimulus packaging that provides state and local government assistance. These are revenue shortfalls that have nothing to do with the operations or management of state and local governments. It has been created it's a national emergency that's been created by a global pandemic. And therefore, state and city governments don't have the wherewithal to weather this without some kind of federal stimulus. Again, directly targeted to state and local governments. The city of New York it has balanced its budget and has passed the budget on time for the last, almost 50 years at this point. Kudos to Commissioner Brindisi and his colleagues at OMB. I'm not going to extend those kudos to City Hall itself. That's another story of great intrigue, which I'm sure Stanley will attest to and may even talk about. I'm going to try to stay away from the politics of the situation. But we all understand that economics and financial management actually gets at the most political of issues. As far as how it has impacted our city agencies, critical agencies like the health department, I think they have done very well despite the injection of politics, unnecessarily so, at different points in their operation. Of course, we know what the New York City Police Department is going through, first having gone through dealing with the COVID crisis and now being swept up in a national movement for social justice in Black Lives Matter, and calls for substantial reformation of the department itself. And then my favorite, the New York City Department of Education, which has struggled putting fire after fire after fire. And, for months, I kind of laid off just because COVID-19, no one could have predicted it. And the department certainly wasn't ready. And I don't necessarily blame them, just because, who would have thought that this pandemic crisis would lead to shutting New York City schools down, or at least, let me not say shut down. They don't like to say shut down. They like to say going to remote or distance learning. They did put together a plan very quickly. I give them credit for that. But now we're months into this remote learning. Summer school was supposed to start, and there are lots of questions about whether it actually has started for the majority of school kids who are supposed to have summer school. And great questions remain about the fall term, whether it will open at all, and if it does open, what does partial opening or a staggered scheduling actually mean for not only the students, but for working families and the parents? So I don't know, I could go on and on, but I'll stop here.
We could spend days on this topic. I actually would like to jump to Stan to give a little context on, not everyone may know the city's plan. So maybe Stan, you could start and talk a little bit about the plan, the sort of 1 to 3 day plan. And one, I'd love to hear about sort of what you think the major risks are, both short-term, things like achievement, mental health, dropout, and then sort of long-term systemic risks that we saw happen, say, in the 70s after the fiscal crisis, when we did things like cut teachers, et cetera. So would love to hear sort of, one, what the plan is, and then what you think sort of the major risks are.
Sure. Let me echo what Senator Liu said. Our school systems in the United States were all surprised and really confronted with decisions that they had to make in maybe 2 days' notice. So the fact that school systems shut down and that they shifted to remote learning wasn't something that people had a lot of preparation for. I think the reality, however, is that remote learning is not a substitute for in-class instruction. It is supplemental to in-class instruction. And if we look at the data, a large number of young people have not been participating at all in remote learning. And some of us thought that that had to do with not having a device or not having connectivity, but it also has to do with the quality of the material that's available online and whether or not people had the support to be able to use any material online. So the estimates from the Annenberg institution at Brown was that about learning for the year is about 2/3 the quality of what people had expected in terms of student achievement. And in mathematics, as one critical subject area, they estimate that academic progress by the students across the United States were between 33 and 50% of what was expected. So that will have a long-term cost. Now the question you asked is, what do we do about school opening in the fall? And obviously we have to have plans that will be subject to change as things happen by the day, by the week, and throughout the month of August before a school opening plan is in place. What was suggested was that the number of students who would be in a building would be restricted to about 50% of the student population. And that the way that would be administered was that some students would attend school 2 days a week, some would attend 3 days a week, essentially offering students about 10 days worth of in-class instruction every month. And the rest of the learning would be remote and would compound the problem of remote learning that we've had since March when the schools closed. That's what has been suggested. Now, obviously, it depends on the size of the school. It depends on the number of classrooms and teachers. But essentially, you would have social distancing in the classroom. You would have the use of masks. You would have testing and contact tracing, all of the things to guarantee health and safety. But you would cut down the percentage of the students to 50%. What I suggested, and some school districts in the United States are doing, like Boulder, Colorado, is instead of attending every other day, 2 or 3 days a week, you would have a morning session and an afternoon session. So every student would attend school 5 days a week, either in a morning session or in an afternoon session. Now that sounds a little odd, but it's the way education operated in New York City in the 1950s. During the period from about 1950-51 to 1959, schools in New York City that were very overcrowded due to the baby boom that boomers that went into the classroom. This was not just New York City, but it was the United States of America. Students had a morning session or an afternoon session. The interesting thing is that there's data about whether or not that worked or didn't work. Attendance stayed constant, achievement went up, graduation for high school went up. So achievement went up even though students had 1 hour less of instruction a day, not 10 days less of instruction a month. So that would be a suggestion that I would recommend as an option that provides stability for parents, provides stability for employers, and provides, most importantly, the maintenance of academic achievement for students. And from a cost standpoint, if we look, and you brought up the example of the 1970s when the city had a very serious fiscal crisis and started off with laying off 17,000 teachers and negotiated away a half a day a week. That was a total disaster for New York City. It resulted in a spike in special education enrollment. It seriously affected student attendance and achievement, and the city paid the price for that for a decade. We lost all guidance counselors. We lost all art and music teachers. It was a total disaster, and it took years to recover from it. I'm not saying we have a lot of good choices, but I do think the double session option, which New York City did in the 1950s, is the one that makes the most sense. Students will attend in the morning, and then between morning and afternoon, the classrooms would be wiped clean, It would provide all of the other advantages that we talked about. And I think, to echo what Senator Liu said, is it must include some assistance from the federal government. This is absolutely insane that we should think about the risks as being only particular kinds of businesses, whether they're small businesses or airlines or whatever. We don't have a segmented society. We don't have private sector, public sector, not-for-profit sector. Each one of them is dependent upon the other. Just like one of the failures in terms of the pandemic is thinking that we could have a state-by-state response. And that has been proved false in the way that geographies that have been successful around the world have had a national approach. So our economic strategy should be an interconnected strategy. Our success in terms of education with less in-class instruction can be augmented by funding not-for-profit organizations before school and after school, and provide more in-class, more in-person opportunity for young people. And in terms of the private sector, they have a role to play here as well. They can provide more in terms of supports for our schools. They can provide more financial support, and they can boost the public sector's economy by taking on larger amount of responsibility. You know, one of the things that we saw happening in the stimulus package is there was federal government support to small businesses. Well, that was great, but large companies have very large supply chains, billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of supply chain. They could spend 10% more on women and minority-owned business, and that would provide a huge economic lift to the city of New York. So I don't think it's good for us to think of our economy as segmented. Each one is dependent upon one another. And if the city and the state got assistance from the federal government, that would help the private sector as well. But returning to your view about the education, I don't think that there's anything more important than maintaining student achievement and economic stability and avoiding the long-term costs. And that's why a stable education system is absolutely essential. It's too bad that we would have to restrict attendance at any one time to 50% of our students, but it's better to do it morning and afternoon than to create a serious, serious education problem for our young people.
Yeah, I mean, you said so many things in there that I want to respond to. First of all, I think that's a really interesting idea. I was very upset in reading about their plan because for families, just to have one day on, one day off, I mean, just total chaos. And for kids to not have that consistency. And I think it's really important, and we all know this as teachers, to be able to connect with the students in person if we can. Right. And seeing them maybe once a week or 2 days a week, and then online, it's just different. So I think that's fascinating. Want to jump on a couple of things you said and maybe have John or Francesco respond to this too. So you mentioned teachers and how many teachers were fired in the 70s. In our budget cuts, does that include teachers in that? And obviously that's a tricky subject with unions and all of that, but like, what are the cuts that are actually going to happen, say, in the education system, and where will we see them? Because obviously we need to put more money in, not less.
Well, at this point, it does not include teacher layoffs, but it will include other impact on our education system. So there will be non-personnel costs that will be cut within the school system. But I think the schools need to be creative in terms of how they manage budget cuts. When I was deputy chancellor of schools in the early 90s, we had a serious economic recession, nothing like what we're going through now and nothing like what we had in the 1970s. And the mayor had proposed a budget that would have cut hundreds of millions of dollars in the school system and would resulted in teacher layoffs, which would have been very, very damaging. What we chose to do instead was to negotiate something called the midwinter recess. Vacation days were lopped into a midwinter recess. Teachers got time off, and the teachers union gave up concessions in their contract worth several $100 million so that teachers weren't laid off. So now here we are, and I've set the clock forward into where we are right now. And you do have vacation days that you could offer to teachers and principals in exchange for additional instruction time on certain days. That would be a negotiation, absolutely. But I think when you have a very difficult fiscal set of circumstances, you need everyone to chip in. The federal government comes in number one and first with resources to the state. Then we need creative options like the double session option so that parents and students are not disadvantaged. And then we need to think about how we could reassess our resources to be able to use our resources more effectively so that students are not the ones that are paying the price.
Yeah. I want to jump back to the space issue. I read today, City Council member Ben Callos has recommended we use things like vacant storefronts as places to either school kids or house childcare centers. Why are we not sort of trying to be creative? And I realize it's a huge expense in terms of finding more space, or is that something that we looked at all? I don't know if Francesco or John could comment on that.
Well, with regard to the space issue, and I see there are several questions that allude to that discuss this space issue, whether it be in our city buildings, private buildings such as skyscrapers, or even in the schools, and being creative about how we use the space or maximize the use of space in schools, whether it be doing the double sessions that Stanley talks about, or extending the school year, etc. Lots of great ideas. These are, I don't want to claim to be an expert in these ideas, but I do try to point out that the big uncertainty here is how long we actually have to do this distancing. And the question there is, at what point or how long will it take before we have an effective vaccine against COVID-19? Because, you know, if we do have an effective vaccine, presumably the distancing norms will be obviated until of course the next virus comes along, which in all likelihood there will be. We just don't know when that will happen. So we need to get a vaccine developed. It is not going to be these crazy schemes that the President of the United States has been bolstering, but we need a real vaccine. In the absence of a vaccine, we do have to find creative ways to use the space, and also to have distance interactions. You had asked early on, Sarah, about well, actually, no, I know Commissioner Brindisi mentioned that we're now, you did ask about it, Sarah, how we're now working through Zoom. This is not going away. This is a part of our lives forever. It's not only in our work as professionals, it's also in classrooms. I'm looking forward to the fall semester where, you know, I am going to go on campus, and my students will be able to either see me in person, of course, you know, with limits at a time, or or online, or in our public schools. So, you know, it's remote learning is actually a good thing, and as Stanley mentioned, it's a good supplement to in-person learning. It cannot replace in-person learning, but it's a good supplement. And so these online tools, virtual interactions that we have now with each other, they're not going away. And it's actually a good thing that we have learned through this pandemic crisis. So being creative about the use of space, adjusting everybody's schedules, both within the 24-hour cycle as well as throughout the annual cycle, and making better use of space, even with, you know, modifications such as plastic barriers, which other countries have used in their classrooms. I mean, these are all measures that should be considered. Mm-hmm. My job is not to necessarily come up with all these different methods and approaches, but to ensure that the Department of Education and the professionals there come up with what the plan is and clearly communicate it to the public, as parents especially, and have some venue for accepting constructive suggestions, such as what Stanley has offered.
And John, as someone who obviously you speak to your constituents all the time, what are you hearing from them in terms of their concern? Are their concerns more around the public health or more around needing their kids to be back and out of the house and in a school building? What, I'm sure you're hearing everything, but
yeah,
what do you think the consensus is?
Most parents want schools to be reopened for in-person learning, but their assumption is already that obviously we would not do so unless the health professionals deemed it safe to do so.
Right.
So most parents would like to have the schools open. Even most kids would like to be able to go back to school. And so that's a goal that I think we all aspire to, but we have to do so when it's safe. And in the absence of a vaccine, we still have to obey the social distancing norms that we put in place. We have to take input from the teachers who, they're the ones on the ground. They know what's happening in the schools, what's happening with remote learning, what's not working, and how they can keep themselves safe. Many of the teachers continue to go into the school buildings even after distance learning began.
Interesting. You mentioned remote learning. I actually agree with you. I was terrified to be teaching online. I found the tool to be, an effective way to communicate with students, do office hours, deliver certain pieces of content, have guests visit from around the world. So there are some real sort of silver linings in it. And frankly, I've been in the education technology space for 20 plus years, and we've been talking about moving to a more blended learning model and leveraging technology. And frankly, we haven't done a great job at it. And COVID has forced us to sort of jump in very quickly. So I think that's very positive. I want to address some of the equity issues around this, because as we all know, and maybe Stan and Francesco can address this from a budget perspective, there were some 300,000 students, I read in an article Stan wrote, didn't have access to devices or broadband. I know we're addressing some of this, but I guess I'd like to know, one, what is sort of the city's effort around this and ensuring that kids do have access for those hours they're at home, and sort of how are we also dealing with things like training teacher? I mean, there's so many steps to this. So maybe Francesco, you could address some of the financial side of getting people broadband and devices, and then Stan, you could talk a little bit about how we move towards actually implementing this well.
Yeah, I mean, in general terms, I mean, I do revenues at OMB, although I'm flattered by the fact that the senator calls the commissioner. But
maybe you're about to be, right?
Excuse me?
Maybe you're about to become the commissioner.
Oh my God, this is jinxing.
After this webinar.
Or maybe not. So I do more the economics, and so I don't get involved into the spending and the policies at the various agencies. I know that the administration announced a renewed push for access to broadband and to internet, in part by using some of the funding that was moved from the NYPD. This was, very, very recent. And, the administration has a plan for broadband access. I mean, as an economist, stepping back from my role at OMB, the infrastructure costs, right, are the ones that are, extremely hard to overcome, right? And so, that is, I would expect that would be the, one of the main hurdles. Hopefully there will be also part of the federal funding that we expect, and that will be some infrastructure component that will help us, go across that hurdle.
I mean, that's how we actually wired the schools 20 years ago, was through something called the E-rate. Yep. So we need another E-rate to make sure there's access at home. I'm happy to Stan, go with you to Washington to help make that happen, because that's critically important. The divide we're seeing, the digital divide, is just, I think, very stark, and we don't want to lose those kids, especially kids who maybe have 3 or 4 siblings at home all sharing one computer. It's not feasible.
I think the issue about connectivity and a device is obviously critically important. And because we were surprised by it, students in New York City, students in Philadelphia, the number in Philadelphia when they closed the school was about 50% of the students in the entire city had no device. So this wasn't something that happened only in New York. So connectivity was a problem and devices were a problem. If you look at connectivity city by city, there's a lot of places in New York City that don't have connectivity. There's places, I mean, a city like Detroit and Pittsburgh, almost 30% of the city has no access to connectivity. So it was something that was a serious problem. But even with a device and even with connectivity, that does not mean that students are learning remote. And the idea of Zoom and doing a class remotely works a whole lot better at the higher education level than it does at the K-12 elementary school level, with English language learners, with special needs students, with all kinds of very vulnerable populations. They just were not working at all. And we didn't have a real picture of what the results were. We don't have any real data that says not how many students have a device, but how many students were learning regularly, in what way, grade by grade, subject area by subject area. So I think this gets back to the remote learning is important, but it is a supplement to in class. And if you think having better connectivity or better devices is going to solve the problem, you're mistaken. Some students will, some students won't. Students who do not have support at home, students who have other kinds of problems are not going to be participating at all. And we shouldn't think that remote learning is a substitute for in-class instruction. To echo everything that everybody else said, is we've got to make sure that our schools are safe. That doesn't only mean remote learning or split sessions, or it means finding other space that is available in the city to be able to expand instruction. In certain schools, it might be outdoor space. When we had overcrowding, we had satellite buildings. We had opportunities to have expansion in spaces that were put outside the building in facilities that people were able to use. So we have to be creative in all the ways that Senator Liu talked about. But the most important thing is just not to think that remote learning is a substitute for in-class instruction. And we need to be very creative in thinking about how we can offer kids as much in-class instruction in a safe way as possible. And one day a week in the building is not a practical solution.
And Sarah, you had mentioned teacher training, and there's a dearth of how to develop teachers for online teaching also. So there's the gap on the learning side, but there is also the shortfall on the teaching side. And I will confess, I was much like Sarah did earlier. When the university tells you to start conducting your classes online, there's definitely both a learning curve and a comfort curve that I admit I had to go through.
Yeah.
So it's harder to interact with your students. I had to implement a rule in my class that if the majority of students are not showing themselves, I'm not going to show myself either, and you'll just hear my voice and see my name in a Zoom cube.
Yeah.
So our public school teachers, they need that professional development also. And you talk with the teachers union and the principals union, they have lots of suggestions. They feel like they're not really being heard by the administrators at the Department of Education. So we need to help on the teaching side as well as the learning side.
Absolutely. We only have about 8 minutes to talk about jobs, which is obviously a serious topic. So I just want to jump into that, and maybe some of the Q&A will go back to education. So, you know, we all know that unemployment is at really, you know, an all-time high. I think it's at 18.3% in May. 1.25 million New Yorkers have lost their jobs since February, and many of them are Black, Hispanic, Asian. You know, how do we start addressing this? So how do we get people back to work? How do we talked about training and retraining and reskilling and upskilling even before COVID. How do we as a city address this, and how maybe Stan could talk about the private sector and how the private sector can step in? So any ideas on sort of short-term and short-term transitions, but also what are the long-term ways we can sort of retrain the city?
Well, I think from the private sector standpoint, it's ironic because while we have a large number of people unemployed, and we have large numbers of businesses and industries that have been negatively affected, there are technology jobs that are available. There are jobs in the healthcare field that are available. There are a variety of different growth areas that the problem, of course, is people need education and skills to be able to successfully compete for those jobs. So I think this is an opportunity for us to ask the private sector to step up and spend more money on skills training, education, and job opportunities for people, not just young people, but others. I used one example in a book that I just wrote about AT&T. They had 100,000 employees who were working on AT&T hardware, and they were at risk of losing their jobs. And they looked at what would be the cost of laying those people off and replacing them with people who had software skills. And they made a decision at the CEO level to spend $285 million to reskill and retrain their existing workforce. And they didn't lay people off. And that's something that could be a collaboration with federal resources and private sector resources to prevent more people from losing their jobs and to cost share what it's going to take to provide people with the education and skills to be employed. There's a bill in the U.S. Senate at this point introduced by Senator Coons to dramatically increase the spending on AmeriCorps, so that young people who are coming out of college who can't find jobs would find an opportunity for AmeriCorps public service job opportunities with an enhanced stipend, so that would be something that could be cost shared again. So it's not one solution that's going to solve this problem, but I think, again, we can't just, find the solution in one place. I think the private sector does have a real responsibility to step up here and do something significant. What I mentioned earlier in terms of their supply chain spending, companies spend, huge amounts of money, in the trillions of dollars, on their supply chain. The percentage of that spending on women and minority-owned business is less than 1%. So if they had pressure or incentive, even through just recognition, to increase their spending on women and minority-owned businesses in New York City, that would be growth. If a small business in New York City, this was a study that was done by the Center for an Urban Future, if they get a contract with a Fortune 500 company into their supply chain, they increased their revenue in 1 year by 260% and doubled their workforce. So that's another way to stimulate economic growth.
Absolutely. John or Francesco, do you want to respond to the jobs?
I can piggyback off of what Stanley already talked about, the spending by corporations or including minority and women-owned businesses in the supply chain of these large corporations. That would enhance our economy and job growth a tremendous amount. One of the reasons that we like to focus on minority and women-owned businesses is that these are the businesses that are much more likely to hire local residents, primarily people of color, primarily of women. And so it's MWBEs, the acronym for these businesses, that serve best to erase some of these economic disparities that we continue to see here in New York and beyond. And the argument that Stanley makes for the private corporation supply chains, that also extends to government. Government, state, city, and local governments still spend paltry percentages of the overall contract spending on minority and women-owned business enterprises. And that shouldn't be the case. Government is, as we understand, the biggest customer anywhere. And you have all different levels of government, huge amounts of spending, a large contribution to aggregate demand. This is the part where we actually can have a direct impact on local hiring through MWBEs. Beyond that, for the long term, because it's not just about getting us out of this, it's also about how to sustain some of the changes and equalize the economic playing field more. Let's talk about the short-term economic, I'll call it stimulus packages that government offers to select corporations. These huge tax breaks that sometimes are invisible to the general public because they don't affect the current budget, but they take huge chunks of future revenues by giving corporations huge tax breaks that are supposedly in exchange for the promises of job creation and hiring, and often are not monitored well, such that long after the tax breaks and incentives are received by the companies, nobody's watching whether they actually create the jobs or not. You gotta have a huge example with Tesla in Buffalo. They were supposed to hire something like 4,000 or 1,400. I forget the number right now, but by April they had already received about $150 million of subsidies, and they claimed they were going to meet their job hiring numbers, but I'm not sure about that. And now, of course, they're going to be able to use the COVID-19 excuse for not meeting those job hiring numbers. So long term, I also believe that we need to get away from offering individual corporations packages, which ultimately don't create any additional jobs nationally. They just simply move jobs across state lines in some cases, and sometimes very short term. And instead use that money to perhaps reduce tax rates overall so that small business owners can benefit from those kinds of tax incentives as well. And when small businesses pay less tax, the owners don't go on more vacation. They tend to reinvest that money back into their small businesses and therefore hire more people.
Awesome. So I'm getting a ton of texts from the Q&A. So I'm actually going to jump to that because I'm conscious of our time, and we didn't even cover half of what I wanted to cover, of course, because these are really heady topics. But let me just jump to a few of the questions, and I have a cat coming at me, so let me just remove him. Okay, so, and some of these may have been answered in the Q&A. So actually, Greg David, a journalist from the city and formerly Cranes, New York, asked, is there any data yet on delinquencies in the property tax payments that were due July 1? And when do you expect to know if the July 15th income tax payments will meet estimates? Can we answer that question?
A couple of things on property tax. We have already part of the forecast. We have already a forecast of delinquencies for 21. There are several types of payers that can pay, can wait to pay single-family homeowners particularly. They can pay up to the 15th of the month, so we wouldn't know payments really, a good amount of money. We wouldn't know about those payments yet because the due date is not passed yet. There have been legislation at the city council that was passed that allows for delaying payments for the first quarter for people that are affected by COVID, homeowners that are affected by COVID, and certain commercial buildings. So, the short answer is No, I cannot tell you what delinquencies are. And then same thing, the deadline for personal income tax is the 15th, as well. We all know, the deadline has been moved to July, and then, with these payments come through the month, and so we'll not be able to tally them up until, at least the end of the month. But it should be noted that these are payments for last year liability. So they shouldn't, in theory, be affected by what happened this year.
Right, got it. So we'll check with you later on that, right?
And I answered briefly because I didn't want to not answer Greg David, otherwise you get your butt kicked later on. But, as Commissioner Brindisi mentioned, or I will say Director Brindisi, but what I'm saying is a premonition. There is a grace period for the July 1st property tax deadline. And, I will say that I got my property tax bill. I was really pissed off, and then I paid it. So I'm all paid up. But, we expect there to be, really, we do expect there to be delinquencies. I've got lots of constituents and, apartment building owners as well as co-ops and condo boards who are saying that they're going to have trouble because they're not getting the payments from their shareholders.
Right.
So I think that there will be delinquencies. How much, it's really hard to say right now. As far as the income tax goes, as Francesco mentioned, it is tax liability for 2019 that was supposed to have been, settled up on April 15th, but because of the pandemic, it was delayed to July 15th. My understanding is that the tax returns, at least for New York State and City, they are generally they generate more refund than actual payments. So more people have withholding that is sufficient to actually uphold their tax liability for the year. So when they actually file the returns, we don't necessarily get a huge infusion of money, but we actually have to pay out the tax refunds more so than accept additional tax payments for the year that transpired.
So the challenge will be a year from now. The real challenge will be in a year.
Yes, and while the challenge is already being felt, because beyond the annual deadline, there is also the monthly withholding that comes in from employers. So it's the withholding that we are already, that is where the projected revenue shortfalls is coming from. It's, corporations are just withholding less because a lot of people have lost their jobs, and they're not, there's no income tax being withheld from people who are not making money.
Yep. All right, next question is, how is the economic impact different from the early 2000 and 2008 crises? How will these differences affect the path to recovery?
Well, I also took a quick stab at that in the chat box. I'm not able to type very quickly, and the questions started coming in too quick, so I kind of gave up.
And you told them to ask Francesco, it seems.
Yes.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you.
I started typing, ask Stanley for some of the education questions, but as I said before, I gave up because it started coming in too quick. But I don't. At the end of the day, I don't think there's going to be much to compare between now and what happened at the beginning of 2000s. We all know that after 9/11, city finances took a huge hit, but there were already indications of recession prior to 9/11 actually occurring. And then, of course, we had the Great Recession at the end of the decade, 2008, 2009. I think both of those are going to pale in comparison to what we're seeing now. We haven't seen the kind of a sudden economic shock, the sudden closures of businesses en masse, sudden job losses, and dramatic rise in unemployment rates. The city that never sleeps actually had to sleep for some time. I mean, I never thought I would see it in my lifetime, but you went around the streets of Manhattan. Things are starting to open up now, but for months, it was a city that we never could have imagined. A lot of it was actually pretty enjoyable, but that's only if you don't if you don't, reckon with the economic calamity that kind of pause actually meant. So when all is said and done, because this crisis, this economic and health crisis that we're going through right now is certainly not done. But at the end of the day, I think it'd be hard to compare any other previous recessionary period to the one that we're going through right now.
Yeah, I would just say a couple of words. I agree with the senator. Second quarter annualized GDP pace, somewhere minus 40% or something like that. I mean, it's never something like this happened. 900,000 jobs, payroll jobs, plus who knows how many self-employed, right? So that 1.25 million that James Parrott estimated seemed to have been, on the money by and large. So yeah, there is not a lot of comparison, especially for the 9/11, which was very much a New York City only event, right? So we got a lot of federal help. 2008, we got the bailout money that, for better or worse, went to the banks that are located in New York City. So this is a different, completely different animal that. Set us back, hopefully temporarily, right? So this is one aspect that I just want to underline. We're in the middle of it. We don't know what's going to be structural, what is really temporary, and what's going to go away in terms of effect when the vaccine is available. And how do we get there, right? So those are all things that are swirling and they're moving all at the same time, right? That there are going to be permanent, I believe, structural issues. Retail is not going to come back. Right, it's going to accelerate this transition. Telemedicine, work from home, all of these things, right, are going to be part of what our future is going to be, even after the vaccine is available and we've overcome the crisis. So, to what extent, in part, the questions from my good friend and great economist Don Davis, right? It's like, yeah, the pool, the gravitational pull of office space, the skyscraper. What are we going to do with them, right? So all of this and what's in your forecast? I mean. Yeah, it's when you do budgeting and you do an economic forecast, it's hard to say plus or minus 20 billion, right? so we do, and that's why we do it often. And as the senator knows, right, we do it often. We revise it often, and we get the evidence that accrues and try to get to the best path for to what we believe is the path for the next 5 years. And we do it every quarter. So as a forecaster, if you need to forecast, do it often.
Absolutely. All right. We only have 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure I get a couple of these questions in. Actually, my colleague, Yasmin Ergas, asked a great question about whether there are policies to recognize essential workers who have kept us going through the pandemic. For example, special support for education. Obviously, we don't have the budget for it at the moment, but are there discussions around this? And might we find other federal funding or private funding to do this?
I mean, there are a number of programs out there that recognize essential workers. I don't think that there's anything uniform on a federal or even a statewide basis. But for example, let's look at the MTA, because people have been asking about transit funding. The MTA, despite its problems, has set up a fund for some of its workers. The transit workers are considered essential workers, such that if any of them do succumb to COVID-19, there's a presumption that it was because they got it on the job, and their families are going to benefit substantially from a fund that the MTA has set up. There are also other programs where essential workers are being provided with childcare. In fact, when the city first announced that schools would be going to remote learning back in March, there were provisions for healthcare workers to provide to receive some kind of childcare in the absence of being able to send their kids to school, so that these essential workers, the healthcare workers, would be able to continue to go to work. So there are some programs, actually a number of programs out there. I can't remember all of them or the details of a lot of them off the top of my head, but there definitely are some programs that target essential workers. What I can answer very clearly also is that there are many essential workers that are not going to benefit from any programs whatsoever, and that those would be essential workers, a large proportion of whom are in the immigrant community, and therefore cannot access any kind of assistance program whatsoever, whether it be unemployment or pandemic unemployment assistance, or even some of the financial assistance that essential workers with the right kinds of papers would be able to access. So in New York City, we have lots of immigrant laborers who have been relied upon to continue to do their work and have had to do so, otherwise their kids would have starved, and are not able to get any form of assistance.
Stan, I feel like you wanted to chime in on this.
Well, I just saw a couple of questions about on the chain. One about from Chuck Brescher, is it going to require, if you did double session, are you going to have to hire double the number of teachers? Actually, that's not what happened in New York City in the 50s. They didn't hire the double number of the teachers. They used teachers to teach morning session and the afternoon session. Right now, you have a 9 to 3 roughly school day with an hour off for lunch. The 4-day morning session, 4-day afternoon session would be 1 hour of additional time per day, and that would be negotiated to be able to obtain that through expanded vacation days. That's what is being done in the city of Boulder, Colorado, and many other cities around the United States that are doing the double session. There was another question about using students in a gap year to provide enhanced and added services in K-12 settings. And that's what Senator Kuhn's bill, expanding the budget for AmeriCorps, would do. It would provide a significant number of paid internships for students coming out of a CUNY or a SUNY or private colleges to be able to get their gap year paid under a AmeriCorps assignment, and that could provide enhanced services in our schools. So those were two questions that were in the chain that particularly talked about K-12.
Yeah, there are actually a lot. I'm now scrolling through even more. There are a lot of questions about also logistics. Like, the question we're all asking that we didn't really cover is how are families going to deal with this? Even your model of morning and afternoon, how flexible will those who have jobs and their employers be in terms of their being physically in the office versus,
Well, that's where your after-school providers come in. We have a network of non-governmental organizations that get after-school contracts from the city to provide those kinds of after-school services on their own site. Settlement houses, community-based organizations, and others. So that space would not have to happen in a school building, but it could happen both after school for people who are having the morning session, and it could also happen before school for people who have the afternoon session. So it doesn't have to disrupt the day for a parent. It just has to be able to be something that is paid for through both the schools by having morning and afternoon session, and then non-governmental organizations by having those kinds of community-based services in art, music, etc., in the community, off-site at the non-governmental organization sites.
Absolutely. We only have a couple minutes left, so I'm sorry for those of you we did not get to your questions. Some of you asked many. Maybe our panelists are willing to hang out a few minutes when we close to potentially answer them, or it sounds like you know each other. Maybe you follow up. I just want to ask each of you, just as a wrap-up question, one, in terms of long-term impact on the city, sort of what are your top 2 or 3 predictions of how COVID, let's assume we do find a vaccine in 2021, what do you think the long-term impacts are, or predictions? And then also a second follow-up question, SIPA students, and there were some 75 on this call, which is fantastic, really are interested in finding ways they can engage. And in economic recovery and community-based organizations, sort of what are ways they can actually get involved? And those of you who work in government, do you think there are going to be jobs for them when they graduate? So maybe we start with John.
Well, I think obviously there'll be
Predictions first.
Well, so one thing's very clear: we'll have to deal with the fiscal impact of COVID-19 for a long, long time. I mean, just look at forget state and local governments. What we're going through. The federal government had a $1 trillion deficit prior to COVID-19. It's now at $4 trillion, and probably going to add another $2 trillion to it. With additional stimulus packages. So we're going to have to deal with a $6 trillion budget federal deficit for a very long time. That's going to affect the next couple of generations of taxpayers at the minimum. And that'll also have an impact on our national economic growth. So so the economic fallout from COVID-19 will be felt by people for a long time. I think, and of course, let's not forget the tens of thousands of American lives lost to COVID-19, as well as hundreds of thousands across around the world. People's lives have been cut short, and that health as well as emotional toil on people is not ever going to go away. But we can also look to the things that we learned through this crisis. We're human beings, and we always try to learn from every difficulty that gets thrown our way. Advances in science, both in medicine, which is invariable, I believe. I just think it's a matter of time before a vaccine for COVID-19 comes along, as well as what we have learned in terms of how we can conduct our business and our activities through platforms such as this, being more creative about how we can be productive, and even allowing employers as well as employees alike to see that they can, in many ways, continue to be productive even without having to show up at the workplace. I think that itself will yield some economic ancillary benefits for both the business sector as well as the public sector. In terms of jobs, I think the jobs will remain. Jobs certainly in state and local government. Government is kind of counter-cyclical, right? When the economy is doing poorly, government is needed more. Fiscally, it's a double impact. It's a double whammy, just because revenues fall short and you wind up having to spend more. But the people that are involved, they're not going to be. They're still going to be needed. Just for example, Stanley's proposal, which I think is a good one, and a number of the questioners asked about the way we reschedule learning in our schools, that will necessitate more school staff, more teachers, as well as administrators to keep everything smooth. The ways that we reimagine government, not only after the pandemic, but also after the social movement of Black Lives Matter, I think that's going to create opportunities in government. So as difficult as things have been, I try to remain optimistic, and I think there will be opportunities, but it has to be entrepreneurial. So, if we have students and people who are just like, going through the motions of checking websites and looking for postings, you're only going to get so far. But if you're going to be entrepreneurial about it, propose ideas and make the right contacts and think outside the box, surely the opportunities will be there.
Awesome, great. Francesco, your predictions and opportunities for young people?
Well, I think, I by and large agree with what the senator said. I just want to add a couple of things. One is that, we're certainly, I believe we're going to see reorganizations of, space within cities and how it's used. I'm not sure whether, you want to have your backyard, and so the type of real estate, which is a single family home, is going to be more valuable, or if you want to walk to work. But if you want to live in an apartment and be close to your work, then you need to take the elevator, right? So all of these are things that in the short term will play out. We're going to have probably more e-commerce, less retail, more automation, a number of things that are going to accelerate. One of the possibilities is that the real estate will be used maybe in a less dense way. And that is going to, affect the price of the real estate, and maybe, families with kids are going to accelerate their move towards the suburbs, and young people are going to come in and occupy the real estate, right? So all of this, standard sort of, or not very standard, but typical urban economist sort of arguments. It's a time of disruption. So young people have, great opportunities, disruption of markets, new ideas, new business ideas. Well, the government will be larger than it was before for a long time. Now we are in fiscal distress, right? So even the city has a hiring freeze. It will not go on forever, right? So the economy will recover, and then we will need all of the talent to help the economy regain its footing as in the next years.
Dan?
Well, I would say I agree that it's not going to be a turnaround that's going to happen very quickly. We're going to be with a very difficult set of circumstances for a period of time. From the standpoint of government opportunities or jobs or things that people could do while they're on the college register, and either in undergraduate or graduate. We had a program that President Lyndon Johnson started called the Federal College Work Study Program. And it paid a portion of salaries of people who are in college to help them pay their tuition. Right now, Federal College Work Study is $1 billion, and it pays 70% of student salaries. And right now, about 98.5% of those jobs are on campus, and they're at low-wage jobs. One thing that could be done is that Federal College Work Study Program could pay 70% of the salaries of people who work for city government and state government and not-for-profit organizations and for-profit organizations. And we could add into the Federal College Work Study budget, and we would have more of our students who could earn more money and have more job opportunities that could lead to career opportunities. And we could use that federal program that was originally set up in 1965 as a great incentive. And that's a way to give more young people the opportunity to work in government while they're on the college register by working off campus. And that's something that could relatively easily be done. And that idea, by the way, which I laid out, is one that the city of New York had back in the 1970s, called the Urban Corps. 10,000 students a year worked on internships. 70 to 80% of their salaries were paid under the Federal College Work Study Program. And actually, that was the first job I had. I ran that program in the Lindsay administration.
Wow, fascinating. Well, thank you to all of you for, first of all, coming up with ideas and optimistic ideas for young people. And I love Francesco's saying that this is a time of disruption and for entrepreneurs to step up, which John said. So I absolutely agree. And I think for the young people on the call and the SIPA students, I do think there's great opportunity to help New York in its recovery, but also be innovators and disruptors in rethinking how we live and work and educate. So I think there's lots of opportunity. So thank you all for joining today. You are three probably the busiest people in New York right now, so we so appreciate your time. Thank you, Esther, for hosting this. Thank you, Andrea and Kevin, for helping organize, and wonderful to see you all. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you all.
Esther.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you,
We'll see you
gentlemen.
all in September. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks so much.